On the evening of April 5th, 1999, 21-year-old Robert Kennedy was sitting around a small campfire next to his stepbrother Richard Steeler and their friend Ben Keegley. They were just doing a quick overnight camping trip at a place called Hermit Cave, which is near Fort Gibson Lake in Oklahoma. Like many other places like it, this Hermit Cave has some local lore or legend surrounding it, which is that even though when you enter this cave initially it looks kind of boring and like there's nothing special about it, if you search around long enough, you will eventually find these tiny little passageways where if you are brave enough to squeeze into them and crawl all the way through, eventually they will open up into these caverns where there are these beautiful rock formations. And this isn't really based on any fact whatsoever, but eventually the boys' stories would switch over to this topic. And it seemed to really resonate with Robert, because the next morning, Robert suggested that instead of leaving, they stay and explore this cave. Well, Ben, he couldn't because he had to go to work, but his brother Richard agreed to. Now, neither Richard nor Robert had ever even been in a cave before, and they had no equipment whatsoever except for one small flashlight between the two of them. But despite all of that, they decided that they were equipped and capable enough to do this. And so Richard and Robert, they entered Hermit Cave and began to explore. Well, eventually, they were searching around with their flashlight, and they came across what did indeed look like a probably mostly unexplored tiny little passageway. And I say probably mostly unexplored because of how small it was. It was maybe 1.5 feet, 2 feet wide, and maybe 1 foot tall. But Robert must have thought that this clearly was what these legends were talking about. And so he was adventurous enough to check it out. And so head first, he dove into this thing and began inching his way along inside of this tiny little passageway. Now, the bottom of this passageway was covered in a couple inches of wet mud, and that was helping him kind of slide along at first. But eventually it got tight enough to where he needed to put his arms to his sides and underneath him to be able to inch along. And then after that, he got to a point about 150 feet or 45 meters in where it was a really tight restriction. And to get through it, he probably would have needed to exhale all of his air and really squeeze through it. But for whatever reason, he decided to go for it, whether it was that he just didn't want to back his way all the way out, or he really still wanted to go and see if he could make it to one of these caverns. We don't know, but he decided he was going to go for it. So he's trying to squeeze his way through this little restriction. He breathes out all of his air, and he makes it through. But as soon as he makes it through, he comes to another one. Out in front of him, there's another restriction. It's shaped like an hourglass, and it's even smaller than the one he just got through. So again, think of a space, maybe like this wide, that he's going to try and squeeze his entire body through. And he tries, but he just can't do it. And so it seems like at this point he decided he was going to just back himself out to where he came from. Meanwhile, Richard, his brother, did not go into this smaller section. Like I said, they only had the one light, and you're going right behind somebody else. It just wasn't going to work. So he was still back in the main portion of Hermit Cave. Well, Robert, he cannot make it through this next restriction, so he goes to back himself out when he makes the horrifying discovery that he cannot do it. Once he made it through that first restriction, that was the point of no return, because A, his legs don't bend the right way to get out feet first, and B, he doesn't have any leverage to push himself back out. And so now, really his only option is to keep going deeper into the earth, to try and make it through that next restriction, and hope that this passageway does open up into a larger space, at least large enough to where he can turn around, because his body will bend the right way to come out head first the way he came, just not feet first. And so he makes the decision to go through that second restriction, and he's trying to get through it, but he just can't. He gets completely wedged in that restriction. Now, furthermore, his arms are now underneath him and pinned to his sides, and I'm assuming that's probably where his flashlight was. So he's probably in the pitch dark. And remember how I said that the floor of the passage was a couple inches of mud? Well, the angle at which he was laying face down was such that if he wasn't actively holding his head up like this, if he just relaxed at all, his face would be in that mud and he would be suffocating or drowning. So he had to hold his head up now while he screamed for his brother Richard for help, because he's totally stuck. And how long can you really hold your head in that position if you're at an angle like that? Well, Richard, he did run and go and get help, and quickly, actually, some cave explorers came, a whole rescue crew came, but it took them 5 hours to get to Robert. And when they got to Robert, there were no signs of life whatsoever. they had to take hand tools and basically carve out the inside of this entire passageway, carving out mud and limestone to even get to him. And then once they got to him, they couldn't pull him out because they didn't have any leverage. So they had to keep on carving away until there was enough space to eventually free him. But by the time they did, he was already gone. It seems like at some point during that 5 hours, we don't really know how long he made it for, but eventually he just could not hold his head up any longer, and slowly his head just dipped lower and lower and lower in the pitch black darkness while he's completely trapped and immobile, and eventually his mouth and nose just lowered into the mud and he suffocated in the mud.